Well, with the clamor over the thriller The Da Vinci Code barely fading, a major Hollywood studio is mining the same vein with a very satanic 666 marketing campaign. We've talked about this on the program before for its new horror film, The Omen. A remake of that 1976 horror classic is the kind of film that routinely makes it big at the box office, appealing to the coveted demographic of young and predominantly male thrill seekers. 20th Century Fox has banked The Omen on a promotional campaign based on 666, the number associated with Satan, the Antichrist, based on Revelation, the last book in the Bible. Even the film's worldwide debut is set for June 6, 2006, or 6606, which the studio conveniently has shortened to 666 in the film's logo. In a moment, we're going to have a discussion about the Da Vinci Code with three scholars who are the best in the business at what they do. Laurence Gardner, William Henry, Glenn Kimball. Get ready for all of them in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, here I am, fresh back from my stint in Washington, D.C., and the Cave in St. Louis, back here in the City of Angels, Los Angeles. Laurence Gardner is a constitutional historian, genealogist, and broadcaster. His writing career has included collaborative projects with national institutions such as the British Tourist Authority, the Government of Ontario, and the Russian Ministry of Culture. In the popular literary world, Laurence Gardner is a top 10 internationally acclaimed author with published works in many languages, and they include Bloodline of the Holy Grail, which gained a UK Author of the Year award, along with the worldwide bestsellers Genesis of the Grail Kings and Realm of the Ring Lords. Laurence Gardner. Laurence, how are you? Thanks for joining.
Hello there, George.
Looking forward to this with you and the other panel members tonight.
Yeah, sure. It should be an interesting discussion.
Let me introduce William Henry as well. William Henry is an investigative mythologist, author of books on ancient mythology and neo-archaeology with a Stargate twist by applying the latest theories in science and consciousness to ancient myths of the gates of the Illumined gods, including Sumerian, Egyptian, and Holy Grail gateway myths. He hopes to uncover the secrets guarded by such groups as the Illuminati. His DVD set, Egypt, The Shadow of Atlantis, links the Atlantis myth with Egypt, ancient beings of light, and an unimaginably powerful technology. William Henry. Hello, William. How are you?
Hey, wonderful, George. Great to hear your voice.
Good.
Hi, Laurence.
Likewise. Yeah, he's there. He's there, hanging out there. Glenn Kimball has a BA in journalism and an MA in communications. In addition, he has successfully completed all coursework for a PhD in communications and passed his doctoral exams. Lacking his dissertation, he was the former president of the International Exchange School, vice president of 2 cellular phone companies, and Glenn has taught school at Southern Illinois University and was ranked by student evaluations in the top 10 instructors at the university. He's been collecting ancient texts since the age of 15. Famous for being able to integrate very diverse texts into a continuous storyline. Glenn Kimball. Hi, Glenn. How are you?
It's so good to be with you, and I feel honored to be with these two good guests as well.
Well, we're going to have an interesting discussion about what is rapidly becoming one of the most talked about issues in the world, the Da Vinci Code. You know, Dan Brown selling 60 million copies. Absolutely staggering. I have no idea. Laurence, you being a very prolific author as well. 60 million books? Can you imagine that?
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, George? I mean, really, when you think about it, books like mine over the last 10 years have sold in their millions, but he's managed to do tens of millions in a much shorter space of time, and it's a novel. So, you know, it really does prove that the novel market is massive out there.
Laurence, I'm going to go to you first, then William, then Glenn, and then we're going to open this up as a free-for-all here as we discuss this situation. Give me your overall take, your impression of the theory behind the Da Vinci Code. And even though Dan Brown claims that this is fiction, that it's a novel based on some fact, he goes out of his way on his website to try to point out that, hey, This is I created characters and things like that. But what is your take on the story?
My take on it really is a bit of a mixed feeling take, really, George, and it's bound up with the way that Dan Brown's own mood has changed with it. To begin, 3 years ago, it was published in March 2003, the book, and to begin, he was saying it was based on facts, and he was pretty adamant about that. But over the time, as various things have been pointed out to him, he's sort of saying, well, it's sort of loosely based on some facts, but it's fiction, it's a novel, and we all know that, My main take on it really is that, there clearly is a difficulty with this, as with all novels of a type, in as much as there's a lot of fact and a lot of fiction all bound up in one, and the readers don't know where one ends and the other begins. Normally with a novel, it doesn't matter that much because the author draws little or no attention to it, but in Dan Brown's case, he did, and he said, here's facts, and in his introduction to the book, he actually said, this is based on facts, and here are a couple of facts. And one of those facts was so far off the mark as to be nothing like a fact, so he was 50% wrong to begin with. It's actually spawned a tremendous interest worldwide in the sort of work that I've been doing for years and years. So as far as I'm concerned, it's opened up a new realm, really, a new audience of readers for books like mine. But of course, the constant questions that we're getting now are what are the facts in Dan Brown's book and what aren't? And for the most part, it's very difficult to say because most of what he writes, even though elements of it might be sort of based on fact, those facts aren't presented in the way that people like myself would like to see them presented. So there's even an artistic and literary license being used in presenting the facts. So I prefer to see it as a novel. I prefer to see it as something enjoyable. It's a fun book, and the movie is just as much fun. I have no problems with that at all. But the difficulty is in the fact that so many people who've never been interested or known about these subjects before are taking the words of fictional characters from the book and believing them as if they've just heard them on a national news broadcast, which, of course, is quite wrong.
William Henry, you're an expert in secret societies that highlight and kind of are weaved into the book and the movie. Your take on the Da Vinci Code?
Well, we could call it, subtitle it, The Gospel of Dan Brown, because it is his version of the gospel. I mean, he may not get his facts right, but he does ask very good questions. We could even say he asked the right questions. What was the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Are there suppressed secrets? The answer is there was a relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. There are suppressed secrets. And what he has really tapped into is this cultural phenomena that began, I really think, in the 90s with, like, the X-Files. I mean, both of these stories are fictional accounts that are based on truth, and both the X-Files and the Da Vinci Code seem to feed this attitude of suspicion that characterizes much of the postmodern world. We need to know things, and we've been deprived of certain knowledge, and as a consequence, we reject religious and political authority as powerful suppressors and manipulators of histories. And a guy like Dan Brown comes along with codes and ciphers and mythologies and says, hey, I'm not replacing the old definition and the old creed. I'm just asking you to look at the truth here. But it's like the plane that hit the Pentagon. We either accept that the thing is there or it's not. And if we don't feel like that plane is there, we start asking questions, and that's the true power behind what Dan Brown has done. He's posing questions, and they're the right questions, I believe.
Glenn Kimball, after talking to you for so many years, this is right down your alley, isn't it?
Well, to some extent it is. Obviously, I am honored to be with the Sir Laurence Gardner and with William Henry, my old friend. But this is first of all, I enjoyed the book, and I very, very much enjoyed the movie. I think it's well worth the price, and if you want to be entertained, I think it's well worth going to see. However, I think that the entire premise for the Da Vinci Code being the secret held was the fact that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene was not the secret. When the original Templars, who called themselves the Fraternal Order of John. They were all members of the Fraternal Order of John, changed their names overnight to the Knights Templar. They were trying to tell us something, that the secret that they found in the Temple Mount was a secret about the temple itself. And we know that whatever secret they found, they put on the back of a horse and it galloped it back, it took it back to France with them. That could not have been the Ark of the Covenant. It could have been the Holy Grail, but what would they have done with the Holy Grail? Why would they have been able to raise an enormous fortune? We have to look at the secret as being a secret that could raise enormous amounts of money in a very, very short period of time. There are historians that suggest the Templars got their money through blackmailing the papistry. The reality of the matter was that the Templars were very chivalrous people. They had a code of ethics that was beyond reproach. When they were arrested by Philip the Fair and Clement V in 1307, they were found in poverty. If they had been bad guys, they'd have been living in the lap of luxury. And certainly they did not get their wealth from plundering in the Crusades. That's not where they got their wealth. They got their wealth from a different kind of secret, and the secret that they found was inside this temple. And it's always been my contention that the secret that they found inside the temple was something that was kept very, very private, very sacred, very close to the vest by people all the way back to the time of Hiram of Tyre and the Temple of Solomon, when he took a copy of the same secret out. And so Hiram of Tyre found the same secret that the Templars found 2,000 years later, and that secret was they found a copy of the ancient School of the Gods, or the temple ordinances themselves. And when they went back to France with these ordinances, they were able to go to the populace and say, look, we now have the School of the Gods. We now have the rituals, the covenants, the practices to go into operation. The only thing we need now is the place. And if you'll donate money to this organization, to this effort, we will go back and we will get that place reestablished and put the temple back into operation the way it had been. And that caused every person, poor or rich, to give everything that they had to contribute to get this temple back into operation. That was the great secret, and it survives in our day. We can talk about the circumstantial evidence that would lead us to that effect,
sure.
but the temple ordinances themselves survive in such organizations as the Masonic Order. And good Sir Laurence Gardner could tell you more about that because he's been intimately acquainted with it.
And Laurence, one book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, alludes that Jesus never did die. And, of course, Dan Brown does not go that far, but claims that Jesus did get married. What is, I'm going to ask all three of you, if this indeed happened, what is the significance of it if Jesus indeed got married to Mary Magdalene? Why is that such a big issue? Why is there such an uproar if that occurred? Laurence?
Well, the reason that it should be a big issue today in reality doesn't exist. That there's no reason why it should be anything to get disturbed about. The problem is, of course, that it's not what the church has taught. And therein lies the problem. Most people don't have too much difficulty with accepting it because, to be really honest, does it matter? And quite frankly, it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the stories of Jesus or his mission. It's just a question of whether he was married or whether he wasn't married. And, the difficulty that they have, I think, is A, the fact that it might be felt that he was married, and two, B that Mary Magdalene was the woman, and from 591, the pronouncement of Pope Gregory I was that Mary Magdalene was not a particularly nice girl. She was a harlot and a bit of a flouncy woman, and they didn't like that association when it began to come up. But it's not new. We can find documentary evidence of this going back so long. It's what happens is that from time to time it comes up again, and each time it happens, there's 10 or 20 years between, and it reaches a whole new audience who are equally astonished as the audience was 10 or 20 years before when they read the last book on it. But, I mean, what one can go back to, royal documents, court records, all of that sort of thing in medieval Europe. The story is there. It comes and it goes and it comes and it goes. And the only people that are ever really upset about it are the church hierarchy, because it's not what they taught. Unusually, what we discover is the fact that they were, in fact, in a way, teaching it. I mean, not the church itself, but the breakaway groups, the Dominican friars and the Franciscan monks and whatever, they were writing about this. I mean, way back in the Middle Ages. So it was quite common knowledge. The patron of the Knights Templars, St. Bernard de Clairvaux, the Abbot of Clairvaux, he wrote about it in his sermons. He gave sermons about it and made it quite clear that it was believed in those times that Mary Magdalene was indeed the bride of Christ. And I think that's where we have to sit this, in a context of it was believed in those times. History is never the event. History is a record of events. And so everything that we have in terms of anything that was written until comparatively recent times when the camera came along is documentary record. It's evidence, but it's not proof of anything. It's just what we take on board as being believed at the time. And the Bible itself falls into exactly that same category. The books of the Bible were written by people who thought that that's what they believed at the time, and it might well have been correct. It might well have not been all correct, but it was honest reporting, and on that basis, one has to bring just about every other document that was written in the same vein and the same faith into play. And, of course, the stories are about the same people, but they're not necessarily the same stories.
What's your take, Laurence, on Glenn's thoughts that the secret was not the fact that Jesus was married, but what the Templars found in the temple?
Well, I mean, the Templar secret really was never to do with whether Jesus was married, because that story was around and it was in the public domain long before the Templars went out to Jerusalem. I mean, what they were about was something completely different. They were excavating beneath the Temple Mound, and as a result of that, they came back to France in 1127. They had the Great Council of Troyes in January 1128, and the most intriguing part about that story is the writings again of St. Bernard de Clairvaux, who wrote up the story of what happened when they got back to France, because he wasn't actually over there with them. He joined them when they got back, but in conjunction with the Count of Champagne, they put together a massive military force, and they took the returning Templars and what they'd brought back with them through France, and he said we had to protect it at all times from intervention by papal forces, because they didn't want the church to get hold of what they'd got. And in fact, they talk about all sorts of things. They talk about documents of record. They talk about gold and bullion. They talk about an indeterminable treasure in sort of inverted commas. There's nothing there at all in any of that record that has anything to do with Mary Magdalene and Jesus.
All right, William Henry, if some of this is true, that Jesus did marry Mary Magdalene, that means eventually there must be some offspring here. That's pretty dramatic.
Well, and it's not just the offspring, George, because it brings up the question, is there really a feminine aspect to God? This is a theology that's been sub rosa, hidden for centuries behind feminine symbols, and it goes to this idea that if there is this feminine aspect of God, then how come we don't have women as priests? How come we only have a male religious authority that stamps out rival beliefs, such as what we might term as goddess cults or priestess cults, of which Mary Magdalene is widely considered by various scholars as one of the upholders of this ancient tradition? She drew upon the ancient wisdom of Egypt, of the schools of Isis. She's often connected with the goddess Inanna and Ishtar of Sumeria and Babylon. So what we're talking about here is really the revelation of the other half of God. And that's what's truly dangerous here, because that is what then begins to subvert the male patriarchal authority. And in my view, the Da Vinci Code just goes to this drive that is sweeping our planet for a balance between male and female.
All right, hold that thought, William. We'll be back with you, Glenn Kimball, Sir Laurence Gardner, in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, widespread interest in our guests, and of course we'll open up the phone lines later on tonight to give you a chance to talk with any one of them, or even all three. As a matter of fact, all three of them, their websites and information on their work is available at coasttocoastam.com with links directly to all their websites. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie with Laurence Gardner, William Henry, and Glenn Kimball. Glenn, could it be the treasure that the Templars found? Was that Solomon's treasure?
No. The Templars found documents. Remember that the treasure that the Templars found fit on the back of a horse and was galloped to France. That couldn't have been gold. And, when we think about gold, the gold of the temple, the temple of Herod, this was the place where the Jews and paid their tithing, and so there was an enormous treasury there. But we have undisputed evidence of where that gold was taken. It's in a relief on the Arch de Triomphe in Rome, right in front of the Colosseum, where Rome depicted its triumphs. It has a relief where Titus carries the treasure from the Temple of Herod back to Rome, and he uses that treasure to build the Colosseum. That's what he used it for. And so there was no more gold. They took it all back to Rome. And so the fact that there might have been some treasure in gold in the Pyrenees, I have yet to, I don't dispute that. I think that they were probably wealthy enough to buy some of the artifacts out of Rome and take them to the Pyrenees, who would have honored them differently than the Romans did. But the treasure that was found by the Templars fit on the back of a horse and could not have been gold. Gold would have weighed a horse down.
Laurence Gardner, is it possible that with the assumption whether Jesus got married or not really being the big case here, but is it possible that all the stories of biblical proportions were wrong? I mean, there's a person who's trying to sue now in court, and I think he finally got into the European courts. He claims that Jesus was fabricated, that he didn't even exist in the first place. How do we know that some of these texts or information even could be correct?
Well, the problem with all of this is, as I said before, when one has an historical text of any sort, a piece of documented record, it might or it might not be factual. It was generally considered to be factual by whoever wrote it. And what one generally has to do, and what I spend a lot of my time doing, is trying to find parallel texts, parallel documents. I mean, for example, you can take any sport or ball game or whatever that happens any week, and you can read about it in one of the newspapers, and it'll tell you the story. But you read about it in another newspaper, and although the basic facts are essentially the same, this or that team won and Fred scored the winning hit or whatever, the story surrounding it is quite different because that journalist supported the other team. So you get these problems in all sorts of documentary text. Now, as far as Jesus is concerned, the big difficulty has been what has always been considered the limited amount, if any, of documentation about him from his own period, from contemporary times, outside of the Gospels of the New Testament.
Right.
Now, the fact is that the Gospels of the New Testament don't actually come from his lifetime as far as we know. There's a lot made about the fact that the four Gospels in the New Testament were actually written in the 1st century, but we don't actually know that. The oldest existing and extant documents, and in fact, going right back as far as history records, the oldest extant documents of those Gospels that the Vatican has ever had were 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century documents. So they weren't the originals, if there were originals. Now, what is interesting, as far as I can see, is that the only parallel documents that we really have to look at the time are the Roman records, because the Romans were the governors of Jerusalem at that time, because it was within the empire, and the Jewish chronicles, because it was a Jewish environment. So, if we look at the first century archives from Imperial Rome, we find a mention of Jesus. He's called all sorts of very nasty names, and they didn't like him very much, and it's recorded that he was sent for trial, and he was charged and sentenced to be executed.
Well,
so we have that in the Roman record.
That would be proof all by itself, at least for me.
Now, if we look at the Jewish archive, the best archive that we have of the first century Jewish culture is the annals of Flavius Josephus. And he, twice within his annals of contemporary Judaism at that time, twice he talks about and mentions Jesus, and mentions him in conjunction with his brother James, who was a member of the Sanhedrin Council at the time. So outside of the Bible, we have record from Rome and from the Jewish fraternity about Jesus and his factual existence. So I think on that basis, it can pretty fairly well be stated that he was real enough. Whether all of the stories about him in the Bible were true, well, that's another matter.
William Henry, Da Vinci, do you believe that his work included code?
Oh, well, without question, and I think that's a large part of his genius. In fact, I think there's a very funny sort of pun that's involved in all of this. Mary Magdalene, of course, anointed Jesus with nard, and here we have this interesting name, Nardo or Leonardo, reappearing today.
That is interesting.
Yeah, just tripping us into a little bit of a different dimension here, asking us to put pieces together that seem incongruous, but hey, Dan Brown's the one who picked the title, and he's brought in the whole Da Vinci mystery to this man of incredible genius, and I think it's apropos that Nardo plays such a key role in all this.
Do you agree with that, Glenn?
Yeah, I do. I wanted to make a comment on the good Sir Laurence Gardner's statement. They did find in the Dead Sea Scrolls from 50 A.D. a piece of the Gospel of Mark, and so perhaps that was the earliest of the. It dates the Gospels as having been written at least by 50 A.D. But the Antiquities, I would agree 100% with Sir Laurence that we don't know. We don't even know that the authors wrote the text, with the exception of the fact that we now have the histories of Mark, his Hasmonean dynasty connections, the fact that the painting, The Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci depicted it correctly as being held in the house of Mark's rich mother. She had a palatial estate in Jerusalem, and Mark played an enormous role in the life of Christ. It is also said that he probably officiated at the wedding of Cana, which was probably the wedding of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And we know that there's also evidence that he probably was in the Garden of Gethsemane and was the man who ran naked from the garden at that particular moment in time. So Mark knew Jesus very well and knew who he was, and Mark was a very real human being, and his ancestors are very intimately connected with the invitation of the Hasmonean dynasty and the invitation of the Roman Empire to participate in the events of Judea, which is what I've been doing with my coursework here. This new course I've been offering is trying to teach people about the origins of the New Testament documents and where they came from.
Glenn, the picture of the Last Supper that Da Vinci painted, I mean, where did he get the concept for the painting? I mean, obviously he wasn't given a photograph of that era, so how did he position everybody in this painting?
Well, I think it's very poignant to understand that Leonardo da Vinci was telling us more than just the secret that the person on his right might have been Mary Magdalene. He used that person on the right as being kind of a double entendre. If in fact you believe that it was John the Beloved that was sitting on the right hand, which is what most of the scholars believe, then you have a real problem, because John the Beloved was born in 4 AD, could very much grow a beard. In the Acts of John the Beloved, it talks about his beard and being stroked, his beard being stroked. And Jesus, if you go to the Bible in John 21, 22, and 23, Jesus turns to Peter and says, "And what is it to you if I let him live until I come again?" Basically inferring that John the Beloved would not die until the second coming of Christ. And then he's the only one, John is the only one who does not suffer martyrdom. He lives to be the age of roughly 104. They have his supposed tomb in Ephesus, but in the Acts of Thomas, he gives his own eulogy. And when they went back to find him the next day, the only thing they could find was his sandals and an artesian well. And the next thing you hear about John the Beloved is he's teaching the Assyrian monks in Tibet about the secrets of eternal life. And then he ends up appearing in China. The stories about John the Beloved in China are extensive.
How old is he there?
Who knows? You know, for the non-believers, they would say he would have been dead by then.
Right.
But certainly he becomes the focal figure of the Nestorian Christians, who are almost as old as the Catholics, Catholic Christianity, and certainly their predecessor belief in Christianity is older than Catholicism. But John the Beloved is the focal figure for the reason why Kublai Khan was so interested in getting 100 Catholic priests from the uncle of and father of Marco Polo and some of the consecrated oil. So in other words, what we have here is an entire John the Beloved phenomena in the Far East that is unprecedented. And Jesus sitting with John the Beloved at the end of his life, orchestrating these events. Now, if you're not into the mysticism of Christ, you'd probably ignore this part of history.
Now, in the movie, The Da Vinci Code, the film very cleverly has a graphic of what looks like Mary Magdalene as she kind of floats in and out of the picture as they do their work and research on it. Is she, in your opinion, I'm trying to remember the picture now, the actual Da Vinci picture, is she in it or not? I mean, does the guy have a beard or is it a woman?
Well, I think it's really Mary Magdalene, but if you do believe it's John the Beloved, you even have more problems.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say, is that Leonardo da Vinci knew this very well, because his patrons, who were the Medicis, their ancestors got 100 years prior to that, got rich with the Polo family and trade to the Far East. They knew very well about John Prester and the rumors of John the Apostle in the Far East, and they had told them to Leonardo da Vinci. He was very well aware of this, and so we have a problem here. You can either believe that this is Mary Magdalene, or you can believe that this is John the Apostle, in which case you have twice the problem.
Sir Laurence, you had mentioned earlier on that Dan Brown got about 50% of the things right. That means he got 50% of it wrong. What did he do wrong?
Oh, I mentioned that, in fact, in relation to his introduction in the book, in actual fact. I mean, he begins the book with an introduction that states that everything in the book regarding art and architecture and secret rituals and something else is factual. So that's a bit of an overstatement, to be really honest. I mean, to make such a blind statement when a lot of it isn't. But he talks about two specifics in his introduction. He talks about the Catholic institution of Opus Dei, and he talks about the Priory of Sion. And this was the bit that first caught my eye, because it's really the first page in the book when you read it. Mm-hmm. And what he says is that the Priory of Sion is an extant secret society that exists today and was founded in 1099 at the time of the Crusades. Well, I mean, both of those statements are absolutely wrong. You know, I mean, it wasn't founded in 1099, and it doesn't exist today. And so what we have here is Dan Brown concocting something by really doing what he does throughout most of the book, and that's taking a series of unrelated things and linking them together. You know, what we have in history is actually four, and maybe even more, but four, to my knowledge, completely separate and quite different organizations with the Scion title. Now, the first one is the Order of Scion, which is created in Jerusalem in 1099. And that had nothing to do with Mary Magdalene or clearly not the Merovingian kings. What it was set up for, and this is quite specifically established in Templar documentation, is that the object of it was to afford Jewish and Muslim ambassadors an attachment to their Christian order of the Sacred Sepulchre. So they established the Order of Scion. Now, once they're all back in France, the need for that sort of disappears. And in 1188, they bring back the name in a way, and they introduce the Prieuré Notre Dame de Scion, which is quite different. It was an offshoot of the Templars in France, and it became a type of academy. It was to do with studying culture and the liberal arts and science, I suppose, in its early form. And it was actually eventually associated with the Académie Française, which was the parallel in France of the Royal Society in Britain. And this is where all the links are to a lot of these names like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton come into play, because they were sort of linked up with this institution. But again, it had nothing to do with Mary Magdalene. And then what we have in Scotland is the Order of the Realm of Scion. Now, this was actually an offshoot directly, again, of the Royal Society. It was a sort of scientific academy, but it was linked to the Stuart kings, and it was attached to, if you read, the English peerage, Scottish peerage registers, they say it was attached to the Order of the Sangreal in Europe. So that gives us a little bit of a clue. The Order of the Sangreal, well, maybe that had something to do with Mary Magdalene. Well, maybe it did, but there's nothing in the record to show that it did specifically. The Sangreal was actually what the Stuart and various other royal houses of Europe classified their dynastic line as a whole: Sangreal, royal blood royal. But then we come to 1956 in France, and we get this ridiculously right-wing political society started up by Pierre Plantard and André Bonhomme, and that's recorded in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And this is just a sort of political association that was really founded to look into low-cost housing in the area of Mount Sion in France. But it didn't last very long. It folded within a few years. Everybody except Pierre Plantard had left it. He was ultimately charged with fraud in court because he claimed that he was the King of France. So this is where we get the Merovingian link coming in, because he produced a fraudulent ancestry. But it led to all sorts of monetary deals, and he ended up in court, and the judge sent police into his home and ransacked it, and he ended up in prison, in fact. So, in fact, by 1984, the whole thing had wrapped up. So it doesn't exist today, even in that form, and it had nothing to do with any of the three other Scion associations or societies, and each one of those was, in fact, disconnected from the others. So Dan Brown's book begins on a false premise.
See, and I think it's been so widely successful because, though it is a novel, everybody who reads it thinks that, they also believe, as you said earlier, Sir Laurence, that it could be a basis of fact.
Yeah.
And that's what's confusing.
This is really the guts of the whole thing, George, and I think it's what William was saying earlier on. There is, at present, and in fact it's been welling for quite a long time, I felt it for about 30 years, and it's getting bigger. There's a feeling that is getting bigger and bigger among people, and I think the internet is probably helping to feed this, in that they are generally feeling, on a worldwide scale almost, quite dissatisfied and mistrusting of their governing establishments and the environments that they're living in. So people are actually looking for something else. They're believing that there are other truths out there, and my goodness, there certainly are. But it's the easiest market in which to feed almost anything, because there will always be a great sector of people who will take that on board as being, this feels good, this feels what I want to believe in. And Dan has tapped very nicely into that. I don't think he's done any harm with what he's done. I think he's done a lot of good, because what he's done is opened up discussion and debate about something which hasn't been a matter for debate for a few years.
Let's get your reaction when we come back, all three of you, whether the Vatican should be as upset with the movie as they are. I'll be back.